What happens when a simple bank transaction turns into a confrontation that exposes deep-seated biases? Malcolm Avery, a man of quiet confidence, walks into a bank expecting a routine visit, but instead, he faces a manager's harsh judgment. What follows is a powerful reminder that justice doesn't always come from authority. It starts with character. In the heart of Montgomery, Alabama, a quiet breeze rustled the leaves outside Haven Trust Bank, a towering marble structure that radiated sophistication and authority. Inside, the air was filled with the rhythmic clicking of keyboards, the occasional murmur of hushed conversations, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting from a nearby lounge. The morning rush had tapered off, and employees were settling into the lull between the day's early demands and the inevitable afternoon surge. At the customer service desk, a young man with slicked-back blonde hair, dressed in a tailored grey suit, sat typing diligently on his computer. His name was Kyle Parker, and he was the bank's manager, a position he held with pride and, to some, a bit of arrogance. To him, the smooth operation of the bank wasn't just about numbers or policies, it was about control. His sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in the neat rows of desks and the polished marble floors beneath his feet, the very picture of order. It was a space he ruled with authority, often reminding his staff of the importance of their roles and how every action had consequences. But today, something was off. There was a shift in the atmosphere that he couldn't quite explain. The tall, sleek, black doors of the bank opened, and a man stepped inside, breaking the usual monotony. Thomas Bennett was a stranger to most in the room, but his presence was hard to ignore. Dressed in a navy suit that was as sharp as his demeanor, he moved with an air of quiet confidence that immediately set him apart. His tall frame, neatly groomed hair, and measured steps exuded an aura of someone who valued refinement but didn't flaunt it. The sharp contrast between him and the ordinary customers and staff in the room immediately piqued the curiosity of those nearby. As Thomas approached the customer service desk, Kyle's eyes narrowed. He didn't recognize the man, but something about him stirred a sense of unease in Kyle. The polished suit, the confident stride, the demeanor, it all screamed of wealth, power, and influence. These types of men, Kyle thought, often didn't like being bothered by the small things. Thomas's request was simple, a withdrawal from his account, but Kyle, always eager to display control over the flow of things, saw an opportunity to assert his dominance. "Excuse me," Kyle interjected sharply from across the room before Thomas could even make his request. "I'll handle this." His tone was firm, almost condescending, as he walked toward the counter. His steps were deliberate, and his gaze never wavered from Thomas's face. There was no welcoming smile, no acknowledgement of Thomas's presence beyond the transaction he intended to control. To Kyle, this wasn't just about processing a withdrawal. It was about making sure everyone knew their place. It was about exerting authority over a customer who, in Kyle's mind, wasn't deserving of respect. "Sir, I'll need to see proper identification before proceeding," Kyle said, the edge in his voice unmistakable. His eyes quickly scanned Thomas up and down, as though judging him based solely on his appearance and demeanor. Thomas didn't flinch. His face remained calm, impassive even. Without a word, he slid his ID across the counter, not showing even a flicker of discomfort. His gaze remained steady, unwavering, as he silently challenged Kyle's assumptions. Kyle took the ID in his hand, inspecting it with exaggerated deliberation. His fingers lingered over it longer than necessary, his face growing visibly skeptical, almost as though he was searching for a reason to reject the ID, some reason that Thomas was unworthy of his request. Kyle's eyes darted between the ID and Thomas, his brow furrowing as he placed the ID down on the counter. "What's the purpose of your visit today?" Kyle asked, his voice sharp now, as if he was not just asking a question but also trying to assert his authority further. Thomas's response was simple, measured, and without hesitation. "I'd like to withdraw from my account." For a moment, Kyle seemed taken aback. He glanced again at the ID and then back at Thomas, who was standing patiently, a slight but unyielding resolve in his posture. "I'm sorry, but we can't process this without further verification," Kyle continued, his voice rising ever so slightly, as though he wanted to emphasize the importance of his role. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Policy or something else?" he asked, his tone now laced with subtle irony. The room around them seemed to quiet, as the tension escalated with each passing second. The few customers seated near the desk exchanged glances, sensing that something more than a simple transaction was unfolding before them. There was an unsettling undercurrent in the air, one that wasn't easily ignored. Kyle, perhaps realizing that his control was slipping, cleared his throat and added, "If you don't have additional verification, I suggest you return when you do." Thomas's gaze didn't waver, and his voice remained calm, though there was a weight in it that carried a deeper meaning. "You're refusing to serve me, then?" Kyle quickly shot back, his face flushed. "I didn't say that." His attempt to backtrack was feeble. "But we take fraud very seriously here, sir. I'm sure you understand." Thomas let the silence hang in the air for a beat, allowing the words to sink in. "I do understand," he said, his voice low, calm, and almost imperceptibly heavy with meaning. "More than you realize." The tension in the room thickened. Customers and employees alike were now fully aware that something wasn't right. Kyle, still clinging to the illusion of control, seemed unsure of how to proceed. His eyes flickered nervously as he folded his arms, trying to regain his authority. "You can't expect special treatment, sir. Rules are rules." "I am not asking for special treatment," Thomas said, his voice steady and unwavering. "Just the same treatment as anyone else." At this, the room seemed to hold its breath. The young clerk at the nearby desk, Sophia Turner, whispered to her colleague, asking, "Do you think he'll call the police?" The tension among the staff was palpable, but Kyle, still trying to save face, ignored it. Kyle's attempt to regain control was futile. "If you can't provide additional proof of your account," he snapped, "I'll have to ask you to leave." Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and made a call. His voice was quiet but firm as he spoke into the receiver. "Yes, this is Thomas," he said. "Could you send someone down to Haven Trust Bank? It seems there's been a misunderstanding." The atmosphere was suffocating. Thomas waited, allowing the tension to build. It was no longer about the transaction. It was about the message. The story was just beginning. The minutes stretched, feeling heavier with each tick of the clock. Kyle stood behind the counter, arms folded, his eyes darting nervously between Thomas and the door, as though he were hoping for an escape, a way out of the situation that was spiraling beyond his control. The room itself seemed to tighten, the air thick with anticipation. Customers shuffled in their seats, exchanging glances, unsure of what was happening but sensing the unease in the air. Thomas, however, remained unmoved, calm as ever, his hands neatly clasped in front of him. His posture was one of quiet command, an embodiment of a man who knew precisely what was unfolding and what would come next. Kyle shifted uneasily, his fingers tapping impatiently against the counter. The more Thomas stood there without flinching, without breaking the stillness, the more Kyle's self-assuredness seemed to crumble. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his authority. "Look," he began, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "I understand that you might be frustrated, but we have procedures here. We follow them to ensure everyone's security. There's no reason to make this into something it's not." Thomas's gaze sharpened, his expression unwavering. "You seem to misunderstand, Kyle," he said, his voice measured but firm. "This isn't about procedures. It's about the assumptions you made the moment I walked in here. It's about you seeing me and deciding I didn't belong based on what? A suit? A presence? You didn't look at my account. You didn't even ask to verify. You simply decided I wasn't worth the time." The words hit like a fist, and for a moment Kyle froze. His lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. The truth, glaring and undeniable, lay in the air between them. He had acted without question, and now he was left standing in the cold, confronted by the very thing he had tried to silence with authority: his own prejudice. The realization stung. The tension was palpable. Some of the customers, whose attention had been riveted to the confrontation, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The room's atmosphere had turned electric, as though the entire bank was holding its breath. Even the younger clerks, who had been diligently working before, had paused, their eyes wide as they watched the exchange unfold before them. Sophia Turner, the young woman who had witnessed it all, felt the weight of Thomas Bennett's words pressing down on her. Her gaze flickered between him and Kyle Parker, a mixture of admiration for Thomas's calm strength and discomfort at the underlying truth of the moment. Just then, the sound of the glass doors swinging open cut through the charged silence. A tall man in a well-tailored grey suit stepped inside, his stride purposeful, his presence commanding. He wasn't just any stranger walking into the bank. He was someone whose arrival changed the entire dynamic of the room. Heads turned in unison as he approached the counter, his eyes immediately locking onto Thomas with a quiet respect. "Mr. Bennett," the newcomer greeted him, his voice laced with deference. "I came as quickly as I could." The room fell into complete stillness. Kyle blinked, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. The man in the grey suit's words echoed in the air like a revelation. Thomas Bennett, the principal owner of Haven Trust Bank. Kyle's face drained of colour, the clipboard he had been clutching slipping from his hands, clattering onto the counter in a loud, jarring sound. His jaw dropped as he tried to process the significance of what had just been said. For the first time in his career, Kyle Parker, the self-proclaimed gatekeeper of Haven Trust, was standing face to face with the very person whose authority he had taken for granted. His body stiffened, as if the weight of his actions, his assumptions, and his prejudices were suddenly too much to bear. You own the bank?" Kyle stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, his composure completely shattered. Thomas turned to face Kyle fully now, his expression calm, but his words carrying the weight of a man who had long understood the value of dignity in the face of adversity. "That's correct," he said, his tone unwavering. "And yet here I am, being refused service by the very people I've entrusted to uphold the values of this institution." A murmur rippled through the room as the employees, now fully aware of Thomas's identity, exchanged shocked glances. The customers whispered among themselves, some nodding in agreement with Thomas's pointed words, others stunned into silence. The young clerk, Sophia, covered her mouth in disbelief, her eyes wide as the truth of the situation unfolded before her. Kyle, once confident and brash, was now left sputtering, searching for some way to regain his footing. I didn't mean. This is just a misunderstanding," he faltered. "We have strict policies here to prevent fraud. I was just—" "Let's not sugarcoat it," Thomas interrupted, his voice steady but cutting through Kyle's feeble excuses. "This wasn't about fraud prevention. This was about your assumptions. You saw me walk in, decided I didn't belong, and acted accordingly. No questions asked, no verification sought, just judgment based on nothing but what you thought you knew, and you were wrong." Kyle's face flushed crimson as he stumbled over his words, trying desperately to form an excuse, but Thomas's piercing gaze held him in place. "I came here today," Thomas continued, "to observe, to understand the experience of our customers firsthand. What I didn't expect was a demonstration of bias and disrespect from someone in your position." His words were measured, but they hit hard, cutting through the bank's usual polite veneer. The room held its breath as Kyle stood there, his shoulders slumped, the weight of Thomas's words pressing down on him. He opened his mouth, but no words came. His arrogance had been replaced with palpable fear, the shame of his actions now hanging in the air like a thick fog. The man in the grey suit, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat before speaking. "Mr. Bennett," he said, addressing Thomas, "would you like to discuss this in the boardroom, or shall we address it here?" Thomas's eyes swept the room, pausing on the faces of the employees and customers who had witnessed the scene. "No," he said firmly. "We'll address it here. Everyone should hear this." Kyle swallowed hard, his panic evident as he tried to come to terms with the magnitude of his mistake. The room had shifted from discomfort to understanding, from silence to collective accountability. Thomas's presence and words had altered the atmosphere completely. As he faced Kyle, Thomas's voice softened, but the force of his words remained unchanged. "Mr. Parker, as the manager of this branch, you represent the face of this bank to every person who walks through these doors. Your actions today tell me something troubling about what this institution might truly stand for, or at least what you stand for." The silence in the room was deafening, the weight of Thomas's words settling over everyone present. Kyle, for the first time, understood the depth of his mistake, not just professionally, but personally. The judgment, The bias, the presumption of power, it was all laid bare. Thomas's gaze never wavered as he looked at Kyle, his words final. "This isn't just about you, Mr. Parker. It's about the culture we allow to thrive. Change starts at the top, and today it starts with me." The room remained silent as Kyle, broken and humiliated, stood there with nothing left to say. His reign of power and control had crumbled, replaced by the undeniable truth of his own failure. And Thomas Bennett, through his quiet strength and unyielding dignity, had not only confronted the prejudices of one man, but had begun the first step toward a larger transformation, a shift that would resonate far beyond the walls of Haven Trust Bank. The silence that followed Thomas's words hung heavily in the air, pressing against the walls of the bank. Kyle Parker stood before him, his confidence shattered, his past actions now laid bare for all to see. The power dynamic had shifted, and Thomas knew it wasn't just about this moment. It was about what would come next, how things would change. He had made a point, yes, but more importantly, he had ignited a spark. Thomas's eyes swept the room once more. The employees, who had previously been caught between the tension and discomfort of the situation, now stood rooted in place, absorbing the weight of what had just transpired. Sophia Turner, the young clerk who had witnessed the confrontation, had her eyes fixed on Thomas, the reality of his words settling into her. She had heard him, had felt the truth of his message, but now, as the room exhaled, she had to confront the harder question: what was she going to do about it? As for the other employees, the impact of Thomas's actions was not lost on them. They might have feared confrontation, but his calm strength and insistence on fairness opened the door to a wider discussion, one that had been avoided for far too long. For all of them, it was a moment of reflection, a call to examine their own roles in upholding a culture of inclusivity. And for the first time, they realized that change wasn't just about implementing policies, it was about the heart of how people treated one another. Thomas glanced back at Kyle, whose posture had slumped even further, a mixture of regret and uncertainty consuming him. The shame of his actions weighed on him like a boulder, and for once he was confronted with the long-lost consequences of unchecked bias. Kyle had always been in control, always believed that his authority was unquestioned, but today Thomas had shown him how quickly that could crumble when faced with accountability. "What will you do, Kyle?" Thomas asked, his voice softer but still firm. "How will you move forward from here?" Kyle shifted uneasily, his face pale, and he mumbled something about learning from his mistake. But the truth was, Thomas knew this wasn't just about words, it was about action. Accountability wasn't something to be taken lightly, it was a lifelong commitment, and whether or not Kyle truly understood the depths of his behavior remained to be seen. Thomas turned to the rest of the room, his expression softer, yet still resolute. This is not just about one man's mistake. This is a call for change, for all of us. His voice carried across the room, steady and unwavering. It's easy to point fingers, to condemn others, but the real work begins when we examine ourselves and ask what we can do better. I want you all to understand something. No one should ever feel dismissed because of their appearance, their background, or their status. Every person who walks through these doors deserves to be treated with dignity. Sophia's heart stirred at his words. She had always thought of herself as someone who treated everyone equally. But the more she reflected, the more she wondered if she, too, had subconsciously reinforced the biases that Thomas had just called out. The subtle ways she had perhaps passed judgment. How often had she made assumptions about people without even realizing it? This moment was a turning point, not just for the bank, but for her own journey toward growth and awareness. "We will not let this stand as a simple incident that fades away," Thomas Bennett continued. "We will be intentional. We will start today, implementing training, creating new channels for feedback, and ensuring that everyone, no matter their background, feels they have a voice here." The murmurs in the room grew louder. The employees began to nod, some glancing at each other, others still processing the weight of what Thomas was saying. But for the first time in the bank's history, there was a sense of hope, a collective desire to move forward together. It wasn't just about policies, it was about their willingness to change as individuals. Thomas's gaze lingered on Kyle Parker once more. "I expect you to do the work, Kyle. If you're serious about making amends, Start with yourself. But understand this, we are all responsible for what happens here, every one of us. This is your opportunity to make it right." Kyle nodded weakly, unable to speak, his eyes brimming with a mix of guilt and determination. Thomas turned to the man in the grey suit, Jack Daniels. "Make sure this review is thorough, and take steps to implement the changes immediately. I'll be monitoring progress every step of the way." Jack Daniels nodded firmly. "Understood, Mr. Bennett. It will be done." Thomas's gaze softened as he surveyed the room. He had done what he set out to do. He had spoken the truth, held people accountable, and planted the seeds for change. Now the real work began. As he turned toward the door, leaving the bank behind, a sense of quiet fulfillment washed over him. He had not done this for recognition or accolades. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. Change was never easy, but it was always necessary. The message was clear. True power didn't come from authority or status. It came from the ability to lead with dignity and fairness, to confront biases head-on, and to stand up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable. Thomas had shown them all that, and in doing so, he had set a new course, not just for Haven Trust Bank, but for the people who worked there and the community they served. As the bank doors swung open, Thomas stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight, the city bustling around him. He had changed the course of one institution today, but in his heart he knew the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The message of respect, fairness and accountability would spread far beyond these walls, and together they could do better. The story of Thomas Bennett confronting discrimination in a seemingly routine bank transaction is a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up against biases, both personal and institutional. In today's world, it's easy to overlook the subtle ways prejudice manifests in everyday interactions, whether in the workplace, in service industries, or even in casual encounters. Like Thomas, we all have a responsibility to call out unfair treatment when we see it, and hold ourselves accountable to ensure that every individual is treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their background. For today's society, the lesson is clear. Don't allow assumptions to guide your actions. Always be mindful of the impact that your words and decisions can have on others. This means challenging your own biases, actively educating yourself, and being proactive in promoting inclusivity in your personal and professional life. If you see someone being unfairly treated, take a stand. Silence only perpetuates injustice. Additionally, workplaces and institutions must create environments where inclusivity is a priority. Training programs, open discussions, and feedback channels are vital tools to ensure that discrimination is not tolerated. By promoting awareness and fostering mutual respect, we contribute to building a more just society, one where everyone is valued equally.